China did not rapidly increase their money supply, but they still have commodity shortages because if, say, Americans print a ton of money and buy a ton of commodities, commodities are a global market. And so that can cause these global inflationary pressures. So you don't just get localized inflation. Usually it kind of spreads around the world. And sharply rising food and energy prices are a big risk for social unrest in many countries, and are likely to cause political regime changes. And so that's something we're facing in the United States. It's something you're facing in the UK. It's something obviously you're facing in many emerging markets. It's a really challenging thing for a lot of them to deal with. And in Europe, I think part of the reason was they've cut off some of their most reliable baseload power. So they've made themselves even more reliant on natural gas, and then you have a shortage.
Germany and nuclear. The nuclear situation in Germany is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's basically it's like solar and wind is useful as a percentage of the grid, but if you have that as too high of an allocation, you can get these shortages if you don't plan for it, if you don't have the storage for it, if you don't have these other these energy markets in place to kind of arbitrage those differences. You need a reliable baseload power. And ironically, I mean, basically with Germany shutting off nuclear, they made themselves more reliant on coal. They could have instead winded down coal, but instead they wound down nuclear. And you have basically just any market that kind of goes after its baseload power and becomes more reliant on imported power or on variable power sources puts themselves at risk for this.
Right. I think you said to me, like, inflation is going to be the topic of the next decade. I think it's going to be I don't know. It feels like we've got a long road to recovery from the COVID situation. Although the only thing I would say on COVID, it feels like COVID is coming to an end in most places. I feel like in the UK it certainly is everyone's getting back on with their lives. But I think the kind of hangover from COVID is going to be lasting many years.
I think so. And as we come out of COVID, that can exacerbate some of these commodity shortages, right?
Yeah.
So over the past decade, commodities go in these big, like 10, 15-year capex cycles where they're oversupplied, and so they're super cheap, and nobody wants to put new capital, develop new mines, new production. Then eventually, demand keeps going up, supply eventually dwindles. We start to get tighter markets, and we get this price spike. And a lot of policies and expectations have recency bias built into them. So they assume that whatever's happening now and over the past 5 to 10 years is that way forever. So whenever we have these cheap commodity environments, oversupply, people kind of think we've reached like the end of commodity scarcity. We've kind of solved our scarcity. We have limitless abundance. We have no inflationary pressures. But inevitably, when that tighter commodity cycle comes, less capex goes into developing new sources. You get that increase in price. And so the past 5 years, we've been in this commodity oversupply environment. And going forward, commodity markets look a lot tighter.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
So you can have years where they go down, right? It's not like a straight line. You can have these, economic decelerations and accelerations, but in general, we're in a tighter market for supply of energy and other commodities. And, basically politicians are going to find themselves in a tough position where if they want to fight that inflation, they have to pull back on things that stimulate demand. But then you can get, slower growing or outright recessionary economies, which people don't like, or they can keep their foot on the gas and keep that demand high, but then they have high inflation. And so you see issues where, for example, people have those energy bills skyrocketing. So some countries, they give people money to energy like stimulus to basically help people pay, which makes sense because people are literally getting their budget gets squeezed, so the government comes in and helps them. But that basically also keeps demand high and is kind of part of this inflationary cycle. And so it's kind of like grass is always greener, right? So if they don't stimulate, people are going to be like, oh, the economy's sluggish, like the government should do something. And if they do stimulate, people are going to say, well, where's all this inflation coming from? This inflation is too high. And a lot of it's partially tied to the money supply, and it's also the commodity resource cycle we're going through, as well as political decisions around the quality of energy.
I want to touch on recycled trade deficits, but just before we get into that, because it'd be useful for people listening to understand. I know some people understand what trade deficits are, but can you explain it again? What a trade deficit is, and the impact of having like a positive or negative trade deficit?
Sure. So basically, if a country imports more than it exports, then it's running a trade deficit. And so, I mean, you can use an example of, say, two neighbors, right? So if there's two neighbors, and one of them is, say, elderly, and the other one does a bunch of services for them, right? So they mow their lawn, they clean their pool, they help them out. So they're basically having a services surplus.
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race, you're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I intend, how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.